I want to bring back now our Rikki Kleiman to get into this here. First of all, Rikki, acquitted of all charges, your reaction?
I think that many people will say that this was bold. This was bold. But what we have to remember is that the prosecution has a burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt as to every element of each offense. And the difficulty that the prosecution had was, although it had a very intriguing theory of the case, which of course we heard about from the very beginning, of an image that stuck with all of us of the rough ride.
This rough ride. They put him in the back of a van, took a lot of hairpin turns on the drive through the streets of Baltimore with an intent to inflict harm.
Right, that was the theory. The problem was the proof. So when it comes time for proof, and the only videotape that they had, and Paula is exactly right, when you don't have video in a case like this, where's only one snippet, and he's just taking a wide turn and rolling through a stop sign, not particularly unusual behavior on the part of a police officer when he's bringing a prisoner who is thrashing about, according to the testimony, in the back of the van. What happened here was they put up an expert witness who they expected to testify, I would assume, about the rough ride, and he said he couldn't conclude that it was a rough ride. Then you also had some fireworks in court about a detective who wanted to get into evidence, and there was all kinds of ruckus about it, about whether it would come in, that she had notes, or the detective had notes of a conversation with the medical examiner about the fact that the death was called a freakish accident before the final decision that it was called a homicide. And that created all kinds of questions about where was all of this information from the prosecution to the defense. What Barry Williams, as a judge, has done here is, some will say, was very courageous, as I called it, very bold, that some will say, because there is the possibility of fallout that could go back to rioting in Baltimore. We hope that is not true. You and I were together, as I recall, when Billy Murphy, the lawyer for the family, spoke at the last verdict, which was an acquittal, and he was very praising of Judge Barry Williams, and that the family has made statements that when they're looking for justice, that doesn't necessarily mean a conviction. That is a very rare moderating statement for a lawyer from the family.
It also seemed, again, to point towards Caesar Goodson, who, of the 6 charged, faced the most serious charges, putting this in the context that stretches back a year to the riots that we saw following Freddie Gray's death. That perhaps in the first decision here, it was a hung jury, and then when Barry Williams acquitted Edward Nero, that perhaps the community could look forward and say, but Caesar Goodson, and those charges are still there. In a vacuum, I suppose, we'd like to think that Judge Barry Williams would not take into account the possible fallout from rendering a decision, but that has to be an intense bit of pressure.
It has to be an enormous bit of pressure, because he knows, because he lives in this community. He is also, by the way, African American, that he would really potentially cause a city at the worst possible scenario to burn. At the best possible scenario, it would cause protests that are peaceful, which is exactly what should happen, for people to be able to express their feelings in their First Amendment rights to assemble and go forward and have free speech about how they feel, but without resorting to violence. The city, as we know, has been put on high alert in terms of the police, and we'll see what happens, and we can hope for the best. One of the things that I do think that is very difficult for viewers to understand, we saw it with the frenzy about Casey Anthony's acquittal back in Florida for the death of her child, that the public doesn't generally understand what the burden of proof is. And particularly when you had such a high publicity case and you had these charges, with this being the person who's at the top of the charge list, as to why he could possibly be acquitted. Well, the problem is that the public, and you and I, we're not in the courtroom. The only people who really know what was brought forth in this court in terms of proof are the people who were in there, and of course the judge. Now, This does not bode well for the remainder of the prosecution's case, though there still is a distinction. The driver was not the person who would have put on the seatbelt. It would have been a person who was in the back of the van. So there still may be some questions, at least at the lowest level, of whether there was misconduct in office about not taking Freddie Gray to the hospital, or about not putting on a shackled person to have a seatbelt. That remains to be seen. I frankly do not expect the prosecution to abandon the rest of these cases. I just don't.
Considering the very critical nature of the judge's comments throughout, especially Caesar Goodson's trial with regard to Marilyn Mosby and her team. Still lots to get into here. Rikki, please stay with us.